as we have become culturally more intellectual and sophisticated as human beings, shouldn't we change our point of view from things so we don't always resort to violence and war and bullying, and start looking at things differently and accepting people for who they are?
That was Stephen Hopkins in a conversation we had in 2023. Our conversation was inspired by the song Time to Act, also known as Near Damn Silent Sleep, which itself was inspired by Psalm 76. I'm Shep Rosenman. This is The Rest is Commentary, where we discuss what songs inspired by the Psalms or Tehillim inspire in my guests. Please support the podcast and me as an artist by sharing, liking, commenting, and subscribing on your favorite platforms. Stephen is a Jamaican-born British-American director and producer whose career has moved between big-screen genre films and ambitious television. Raised in Australia and England, he cut his teeth on music videos, starting with bands like Duran Duran, and his debut feature Dangerous Game before Hollywood came calling. Stephen broke through as a director with A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, and the gritty sci-fi sequel Predator 2, then went on to direct action and thriller films like Judgment Night and Blown Away. Hopkins showed a very different side of his craft with the Emmy-winning HBO film The Life and Death of Peter Sellers, and later with Race, his politically charged biopic of Olympic legend Jesse Owens. On television, he helped redefine television drama as a producer and key director on 24, was the guiding hand on shows like Californication, House of Lies, and the recent spy thriller Liaison. Stephen is a longtime client, and most important, he has become a dear, dear friend. In our conversation, we dive into how jagged electro-punk sonics collide with lyrics rooted in empathy, protest, and spiritual unease. Remixing psalms for the present tense, what happens when ancient religious language gets dragged into today's news cycle of violence and fear, the conflict between survival instinct and compassion, war, protest, free speech, and dissent as a kind of health check for any society. Underneath it all is a stubborn hope that even in the middle of all this noise and conflict, real change remains possible. Let's start off by listening to Time to Act. Stout-hearted men are choosing silence, breathe destruction once again. Did God fall silent? Is God asleep? The piles and piles of people dying on me deep. Time to choose not to be silent. Time to act as a reply. Time to choose not to be silent. Time to act is our reply. Hi, Stephen. I'm so glad you were able to join me.
Here we go. It's a whole new version of us here.
So you've listened to Near Damn Silenced Sleep, and in the same way that the psalmist inspired me to write the song, my hope, of course, when sharing these is with you, that it inspires something in you, whether it's curiosity, questions, commentary. I even invite derision if you hate a song, but so far people haven't hated anything. But so what curiosities did it inspire in you?
Well, the song itself is, we talked about what kind of song it would be, and I'm a big David Bowie fan, and so you went through your enormous repertoire and chose this one, and it has that sort of electro punk, kind of an angry sounding piece of music, but then of course the lyrics are sort of quite the opposite, which is fascinating to me. The lyrics are very empathetic and angry about social issues, but empathetic towards the subject matter. And I think what was interesting to me when I read the original psalm, that when you read some of these psalms, being a bit of a atheist myself or a spiritual person in a different way, then the psalm reads as really quite aggressive. If you don't think of it the way that you've thought of it, the psalm feels quite warlike and aggressive, and but in a completely different way than you've approached it, where you've approached it sort of as attrition towards injustice, or as you say, one point, which I really like, is God asleep, then, which is a great basis for the whole song for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the process of writing these songs is not necessarily to honor the psalm, but it's to see what the psalm brings up in me. Whether it's honoring, that happens sometimes, like the psalms that end up being about love. Of course, I write about love, and I try to make the love be the love of God, if I'm feeling it in a moment, but also love of Shari, who is divine. So I try to find that sense of play when I want to kind of honor the spirit of the psalm. But then there are others like this one, which it's not quite about war. It's about war. It's about God as warrior and talking about conquering nations. Their God broke the fiery arrow of the bow, the shield, and the sword of war. And it goes on. You were resplendent, glorious on the mountains of prey. Now, that verse in particular just evoked stuff in me. I mean, read one way, God is breaking the shield and sword of war. Well, that suggests ending war. But yet, so much of the psalm talks about fury and the fact that God is going to conquer through war. I had trouble with the concept. And it's a basic human concept. I mean, we live with tensions and conflicts in ideas. You can be empathetic and angry at the same time. It struck in me this whole idea that I'm uncomfortable with the result. And that's how we get to, is God asleep? It's how we get to the veteran on the side of the road asking for food, because these are things that bring up fury in me as someone who is not an atheist. I'm a strong God believer, though I completely understand the atheist view. This is a way of me grappling with this sense of injustice that, God is fucking it up if God's actually in control. And we're fucking it up if God has said to us, dude, I gave you the keys to the kingdom. You got to make it right.
I'll just say, I'm actually not an atheist. I have a lot of different spiritual beliefs, but from different religions and philosophies. Buddhism being a philosophy, or I've known and read and studied parts of the Bible and parts of the Quran, and a lot of different type of things, even like Wicca, and paganism. So I take what I feel intuitively is right. But what's really interesting now is in the wrong is a bad word. There are people in the world who would read this, who would see it as a call to violence, on behalf of a belief, and as clearly you're in a country which is having a problem with some of that right now, where people are using religion for what I believe as incoherent and brutal reasons to do things, because it's an excuse. It's an excuse for, and none of us can really figure it out. But it's really refreshing how you interpret it, because that helps me a lot. There are parts of what I call the Old Testament, which is, I think, obviously the Testament that you study, and where it feels like God is just a frightening, scary person.
So there's so much in our prayers, and so much of our philosophy is to be at one, or shalem, whole, peaceful, with each other, with ourselves, and of course with God. By the way, I don't ultimately articulate them as three concepts, a trinity, if you will, but really it's all the same thing. I think and you mentioned it before, you take bits and pieces of different spiritual practices and philosophies, and you find what resonates for you, and you work and grow with that. I think that is the essence of what Judaism or the Jewish Bible is asking of not only Jews, but the world. And we don't talk about it enough. We talk about Abraham being an innovator in being the first ethical monotheist, but the corollary to it, if you look at the text and many of the biblical texts, it's all about coming to know God. Now, yes, the writer or writers of the Bible use language that's very jealous God type and angry and fierce. One of my friends said, God's just an asshole in those passages. And it's true. I mean, asking people for sacrifices, asking Job, look at what happened to Job and the sacrifice of his whole life, basically. And it's only just a test, right? Or the test with Abraham, right? That's very difficult stuff to manage. But if you look at the motive, the goal is to know God. How do you know God? I believe it's through doing what you've done, which is exploring different spiritual practices and then applying them in your life. And in that way, you're getting to know something greater than yourself. That worldview is in conflict with the worldview that I grew up with, which is, Judaism is all about doing. It's a religion of action. Do the mitzvot. Don't do that which you are forbidden to do. And that's how you come to know God. And for me, I think that construct is a pathway. It may be the only pathway. It could be that I will hit the pearly gates and God will say, Shep, you didn't do this, you didn't do this, you did that, and you did that. And I will have gotten it wrong. It also could be that God will say, it would have been good if you did that more, whatever, pray 3 times a day, say 100 blessings a day, not eat at restaurants that don't have rabbinic certification. But you know what? You got it right. This idea of exploring and trying to come to know me, I really appreciate it. You get a B+. I'm going to put you in the mezzanine section, but not like right behind home plate. I, I don't know. And I don't think any of us do. I mean, I think that there are people who claim to, and they might know, but that knowledge is not a knowledge of certitude unless they've actually been face to face with God and not their imaginations or subconscious or peyote or whatever it is. We're not going to know till the next world, if there is a next world.
All the way through history. I mean, there's obviously a dark side of humanity, but that's the kind of side that if we're talking about creating more wars, we're talking about creating more trauma and veterans and people, like in your song, and people who suffer. But it's possibly because human beings may not exist anymore if we had been these survivalists on a scale that's unmeasurable, really. We will do almost anything as a race to survive, as a species. And if that means hurting and scrabbling and killing and pushing people out of the way and grabbing and stealing, and if we think that's what's going to make us survive, we have a history of doing that. And what's extraordinary to me is I've been lucky enough to travel around the world and work with a bunch of different NGOs and groups of people where I've seen the opposite, thank heavens. Because if I hadn't, when you're a young person, you think all old people are cynical and they're all going, oh, wait till you grow up, you'll realize how horrible everyone is. And we go, no, they're just old. And as I get older, I get more cynical. I get cynical. I see so much despair and the same big mistakes human beings making over and over and over again. And you're desperate to be empathetic to humans. You're desperate to care and believe in them. And it's really hard sometimes unless you have been lucky enough, like myself, where I'm not a big fan of the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not a big fan of the Vatican. I don't like the way they have often they are I think kind of a dangerous institution. But I've met Catholics who are just so wonderful, and I've been in the middle of Africa with nuns who are not really connected to Catholics, who have given their lives to help people with no care for themselves at all, where a few miles away, Roman Catholic planes are dropping leaflets telling Africans not to use condoms because it'll give them AIDS. So the contrary nature of that is extraordinary, and every religion has it. Hinduism has this wonderful benevolent side, but it also has Krishna has these. It's a part of our human nature, isn't it? Within ourselves, we have a very dangerous need to survive, and that creates violence and desperation within us. But then so you have to start evaluating what is right and wrong, which is a dangerous thing to do, but you have to, I think. And then, of course, you look at Russia right now and you look at Putin, and it's hard not to see that figure as someone who is dangerous and wrong.
Everybody has their own motives, and they may want to do something because it's good for Ukraine, or we may want to do that. But at the end of the day, the United States, France, and Britain, and others will only make the choice to do something if it's also good for them. Whether it's because it's good for the world economy, they're selling more planes and tanks and jeeps, they're selling consulting services, oil prices, whatever it is, those two things always have to align. And that goes back to this inherent tension. You have to seek peace while at the same time pursuing war. Those two things are in opposition to each other. And the way human beings, I think, manage them is through finding their own vested interests and in making a choice. But it becomes problematic only when we don't disclose that, when we're not talking about it.
Well, I think there's a measure that you can make. If a country, one of the reasons those countries might help Ukraine is to get votes. If your country thinks, God, we should, or God is wrong with it, if we should really fight this war, and if they feel that, then that'll help make that decision as well, on top of all the economic stuff as well. But the real measurement is whether countries will allow its own people to protest and disagree with them, I think. And clearly some countries won't. Clearly Russia won't allow any protest. Clearly Iran won't allow any protest. Clearly a lot of countries in the world, a lot of despotisms will not allow that. And me growing up, I'm in Britain obviously, but growing up in Britain as a kid, I always admired America because they protested and fought for stuff, you know, and they should have done, because I mean, black people couldn't vote in America until I was 10 years old, which is crazy. So I mean, it's astonishing how, you know, and of course there's still enormous racism and disparity and all that kind of stuff in America, but also in the rest of the world. But you know, I was gratifying for me to see that there are big protests in Israel right now. You know, they that there are people disagreeing with their government's point of view of things and how they approach stuff. You know, which is clearly one of the most controversial places in the world. But but these people protested. You know, in Iran, they get hung, or and I think that is probably a measure of a government that you can be empathetic towards, that you can feel like you can feel their need for how they want to live their life and how they want their culture to progress. You know, because if a country or a nation or a culture refuses to allow controversy, refuses to allow protest, then there's obviously something inherently wrong with that culture. If that culture, that it means that they can't see outside their narrow version. I mean, look at Afghanistan. I feel like right now in the world, women are one of the most attacked of the race. It feels like men are terrified of women right now, of the power they have and stuff. And it's, you know, I feel like the world is going backwards in that form. You know, it's going backwards in racism. It's going back in forms of, you know, misogyny, and of course it leads to revolution that always has collateral damage to it.
You said, you know, things have gone backwards, and I agree with you in a lot of respects. They have. You know, it's a push me pull you. I think for each step forward we make, we take at least a step back in some respects, and then we may take 3 steps forward, and then we have to take a step back. Whether this is true or not, I read it somewhere. Couldn't tell you where. The LGBT movement, LGBTQ plus, had a massive set of growth after Will and Grace when there were gay characters on television. That's not to say that all of the other work that was going on societally, Common Threads and AIDS advocacy and so on, wasn't part of it, but the public exposure opened things up a bit. And that led to, not getting the facts right here, but it's all for the purpose of making a point, that eventually led to gay marriage. And now what we're seeing in response is, well, in Israel, we're seeing laws against homosexuals. In the United States, we're seeing a banning of talking about homosexuals, and some states considering to get rid of gay marriage. That dynamic of push forward, in my view, and push back, that's what happens. And the question is, and this comes back to belief, do you believe, you, Stephen, me, Shep, does one believe, I'm quoting, I think everyone knows it as Dr. King, but it's really somebody else, Dr. Thomas, I forget his name. Do you believe that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends toward justice? Right? If you do, then the pushback blip, okay, it's just part for the course. Hold your breath, stay on task, and everything eventually will be okay, even if we don't get to see it. Or do you believe that, yes, there will be the nuns and other generous, warm, kind, wonderful people, but there will always be the same number of very difficult, restrictive, controlling, hateful, evil, pick your word or words, people, and we will just always be in this push me, pull you dance forever and a day. And so I'm asking, what does Stephen Hopkins believe?
Maybe things have stopped going forwards then. I feel like it's hard to understand why people are against homosexuals. I mean, I can probably look back in history and find reasons, but we're in the 21st century, you know, and I think when Martin Luther King got shot, assassinated, murdered, and the riots in Chicago happened, Robert F. Kennedy went and made this amazing speech there, which everyone should look up. And his speech, I think, was based on Plato or Sophocles, or which I don't think you'd find many politicians quoting anymore. But it's the famous old speech about soothing the savage breast. As we have become culturally more intellectual and sophisticated as human beings, shouldn't we change our point of view from things so we don't always resort to violence and war and bullying, and start looking at things differently and accepting people for who they are? You know, there is I don't know about any religion, not even Satanism, which I've spoken to Satanists too in my life. There's no religion that I know of that, well, with the possibility of Mormonism, I'm not sure, where it states that racially people are inferior to other races. But it seems to exist. I mean, in the so-called Constitution of the United States of America, everyone's supposed to be equal. Clearly not. It's clearly not applied to some politicians. Don't apply themselves to it unless they feel like it, unless they could use it to get what they want. So I don't see anywhere where it says you're worse than me in any religion, or I mean, in some cultures there are. In some cultures, women are second class citizens, I think. And in some cultures, like in India, there's a caste system, which is, I don't think, a religious thing. I could be completely wrong. Maybe it is. Maybe it comes from Hinduism. But it's a little crazy when we can do the things we can do as human beings. And right now in the news, they're spotting planets that we could move to one day, which are similar to Earth and this and that. If we're able to do this extraordinary things, if I'm able to look at you on this piece of metal and chat to you across the world, that these things should even be talked about, that should even be a part of conversation, and I take, you're right, that the LGBT plus community, which has been absolutely harassed and obliterated for centuries, it is relatively insane that it's sort of disgusts people, or if it's something that should be wiped out. Or, I'm sorry, I have a real problem with abortion being banned. I cannot understand any, hey, last week the Pope said this amazing thing, which went very quietly under the radar. He said that homosexuals were not criminals and should be invited into the church. And he said it out loud. If you go online and find it, he says we should invite them into the church, and they shouldn't be seen as criminals, and they're all children of God. And some of these are actual quotes from him, I think. And it didn't get out. It was like, I saw it, went, oh wow, what a huge thing. Nothing, that's a step forward for me. That's like a huge step forward for me. And but it feels like it shouldn't be a step forward. It feels like it's kind of preposterous that this thinking even exists. Maybe I'm just this hopeless liberal, but I hope in my old age, I'm 5 years older than you, that I still want to have hope that things can change for the better. And it just feels in my lifetime that, as you say, it goes forward and then it gets crushed. And I don't feel like we're really going forward. I don't feel like we've really gone that far forward as we should have done. If you look at how much science has gone forward in the last 100 years, if you look at how far, when I was born, if you look up in the Guardian website, you can see how many people were born or on the world when you were born. When I was born, there were 1.8 billion people on Earth. Now there are 8 billion. So with this expansion of consciousness and expansion of knowledge, why are we fighting about these crazy things?
I mean, it's one thing to say they're children of God, they're not criminals. It's another to say homosexual acts are not problematic in God's eyes at all. What's the fuss about? So the Pope, I didn't read it. You're just telling it to me now. This is the first time I'm hearing it. I've noted it down, so I go look it up. If the Pope went that far, that's radical. It's radical enough, right? And it may be enough. Tayenu, maybe enough. That's the Hebrew for enough. But he also might not have gone far enough. And we'll have to see in 2 months, 2 years, 2 millennia to see what happens there. But I think that that's the source for many people. And for other people, even if they don't have a biblical source, because they're not religious, that biblical feeling found its way into secular atheist communities and has become rampant there, especially in places that already had these things going on, but it wasn't public, like in India or in various places in Africa. When you combine religious strains with any type of difference, but especially this type of difference, when it's practiced, the fear grows around that for the people who find it alien, who are threatened by it. Whether it's because they don't want to accept that they're homosexuals themselves, that happens sometimes, or they simply fear anything that is other. Color of skin, sexual practices, doesn't really matter. People are wired that way. And this goes to that issue. It could be that those of us who are open to other humans and to engaging in other, we may be the ones who move to that planet because the locals may not want us. The otherness conversation is an important one to me because, I presumably look like a regular person, but I've always felt other. Maybe it's because I'm Jewish. Maybe it's because I was socially awkward and didn't know how to talk to my classmates, or because I was undiagnosed until much later. ADD kid who was never paying attention, always looking out the window and getting in trouble. And the kids would make fun of me for that. And I wasn't particularly athletic until later. It's like I always had this feeling of other, notwithstanding the fact that I eventually became right in the center of social circles, of organizations and communities, even like when I was on the executive committee of a shul, a synagogue. You can't get more center than that. I still felt other. And part of that's because I would take positions that were contrary to other members of the executive committee. Not because I wanted to be contrary, but because that's what I believed was the right decision. And sometimes I was right, sometimes I was wrong. But that sense of otherness for me allows me to have empathy for people from different communities with different backgrounds. My brother was a key part of me exploring engaging with otherness because, we never talked about it when I was a kid, but I knew he was gay. And I had to come to terms with the fact that I loved him. He was my brother. My parents wanted him around. They just didn't want to talk about his gayness, his status as a homosexual. But I could. Like once I became an adult and found a voice, of course, the first time he ever talked about it explicitly was when he was telling me that I shouldn't date a German woman. And I said, that's rich. You're like, it's just, why? Because mommy and daddy will be upset. I still call my parents mommy and daddy. And I said, that's rich. And he said, why? I said, it's not like you're going to stop being gay. And he says, as only my brother could, you think I tell mommy and daddy I suck cock? Growing up in the Orthodox community, you couldn't be LGBT openly. And if you were LGBT and not open, but kind of doing it in a hidden way on the down low, if people suspected it, you were looked down upon. Today, parts of the modern Orthodox community are much more resolved and in line with progressive or liberal worldview in which people are people, they're going to do what they're going to do. Let's find a way to keep them in.
I think I'm bringing up all this stuff because I was fascinated how you interpreted the wording of that particular psalm for this song into something that was fighting against, I guess, but in a way where it wasn't causing damage at the same time. I've stepped away from America for a while because I feel a little sad about the country, and obviously one of the things that really bothers me there is all the violence that happens in that country, where when the Constitution actually was amended, because you can amend it, even though a lot of people say you can't, then there's all these gun laws which are preposterous to everyone else in the world. No one else in the world has this open warfare going on in its own country for no apparent reason at all. Usually there's some reason for it, as opposed to just mass murders happening all the time. There was a time, I assume, where there was a point to that you were able to not let the government push you around. I don't care how many guns they've got now. The government, if they want to push you around, they can push you around. I mean, the idea of the gun laws in America are so outrageous and so destructive. I mean, I know when Clinton banned a lot of the gun laws, the automatic weapons, I believe I was read yesterday that shootings dropped 48%. And then when Bush overturned it, or I always say Cheney, not Bush, when Cheney overturned it, then they shot back up again. And you have to look back, I think. Sam Harris, do you know who Sam Harris is, the writer? I find him amusing. He has a great podcast with Ricky Gervais, actually, they make me laugh. But in one of the opening of his books, he quotes all the different places in the Bible where it says, if your child argues with you as a parent or turns his face away from God, he has to be stoned to death. And there's a number of times it says it. You can't really believe that. You can't really believe your child, as we said. So therefore, there's a nature of parable to it, right? There's a nature of teaching. But there's a lot of people who claim the Bible is absolutely the truth. And this is what you have to follow it word by word by word, unless you don't feel like it, of course, then you don't follow it word by word. So it's this kind of, when you see that psalm and you write this song about it, clearly there are teachings in there. They're not absolute, this didn't happen that day, or, so it's about how to sort of use to get empathy into that world where people are so busy defending their point of view that they stop really investigating. You clearly investigate and think about and dissect what you learn, and some people don't.
Look, I think that there's merit to taking things literally, but it's just not my calling. My sister is ultra-Orthodox. She and her community take a lot of things literally. I mean, some of it you can't take literally. Like, for example, there's the verse that talks about wearing phylacteries, tefillin. It says that you should put them between your eyes. So literally read that, well, that would go on, where your glasses and my glasses are sitting, right? But they don't. They put them right at the crown of the head. Now, the Karaites, they wore their tefillin right here, like right at the bridge of their noses. So even my sister, who is a strict constructionist by and large, is a strict constructionist of what the rabbis have written rather than what the text itself says. And, I've had a lot of movement in my life religiously. I grew up modern Orthodox, took it very seriously. When I was studying to be rabbi, I had an argument with my Rebbe, the rabbi who was training me, that led me to kind of leave Jewish practice altogether. And I was very, very particular in how I left. I knew that what I was learning wasn't right based on this particular conflict, but I also knew that I believed in God. So the thing that remained with me when I left this yeshiva was God. And I used this metaphor when I was talking to my then ex-girlfriend's dad. I guess she's still an ex-girlfriend, but only recently then, because she also left religious practice, and he was telling me how upset he was. And I said, through no fault of yours, most likely through the yeshiva education that she got growing up, She built a structure, philosophically, intellectually, spiritually, that was wrong. It was not solid. And she's leaving it behind to rebuild it brick by brick. I said, I don't know if this will be the case for me, but in her case, I promise you that she will end up as part of the religious community and religiously observant, because she's going to build a religious structure brick by brick. Just give her time. Sure enough, in her case, she ended up part of the Chabad community, very happy, a talented woman. And in my case, I've been in and out and in and out and in and out. But the constant for me is the God piece. I believe, or want to believe, and therefore choose to believe, that there is something greater than I. Say something greater than me. Jews call that God. Other religions may call it other things, karma, energy, who knows? But so for me, the piece that I've always played with is, well, what does God want of me? And that's why I come back to this issue of the way you're approaching this. You're studying a variety of religions. You're reading the Quran. You're reading about Wicca. You're talking to Satanists, and you're gaining like a best of practices. You mentioned Buddhism before. We've also talked about Hinduism. You're taking the best of each of these things and engaging with something greater than yourself. I mean, there's nothing to me more noble than that practice.
Well, it comes back to something you said late ages ago too, which I think is the idea that God gives you the keys, and there's a free will aspect with how you behave with the tools, right? But then, of course, there's a lot of dogmatism in some religious texts, which contradicts that, doesn't it? It says you have to do it like this, otherwise you're a terrible person. So, yeah, I think it's important, I think, for people to remember that we're supposed to be human and have the human experience with all the frailties and flaws and often bewildering beauty of that. But that means you have to question. You have to question these things, don't you? And that's what it goes back to what I was saying. Any culture is measured by how it reacts to it being questioned, I think.
I so value you as a human being, as a client, and most important, as a friend. I look forward to chatting with you whenever. We don't need the podcast to have these kinds of conversations.
Absolutely. No, I'm just going to call you whenever I have a crazy idea from now on. Watch out.
Thanks so much for listening. Special thanks to Stephen for joining me, to Emil Stern for his help in producing this episode, to E-Rose for his help producing the song in this episode, to Jessica Hanna Sweedler for her help on social media, to Liat Silvera for designing the podcast logo, and to my wife Shari, who is all about action and empathy. You can find Time to Act and all of the other songs in this song cycle on most platforms that stream or download music, including Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. Again, for the shameless self-promotion, it really helps if you share the episodes and songs, and if you like, comment, and subscribe to the podcast, and to me as an artist on your favorite platforms. On the next episode of The Rest is Commentary, I'll be talking with Barbara Edelsten Peterson, a world champion endurance athlete, sports psychologist, and author whose work brings together grit, joy, and a uniquely Jewish take on quelling. We discuss how passion, authenticity, and resilience shape a meaningful life, Quell as a practice to foster community and pride, the impact of sports and other accomplishments on life philosophy, honing vulnerability and authenticity, how injury can be a transformative experience that creates opportunities, how flow states influence mental health, embracing imperfections and starting anew, and so much more, all inspired by Barbara's thoughts after listening to Black and White Photo, inspired by Psalm 78. You can find out more about Barbara by going to her website, Barbara Edelsten, Edelston, Peterson, that's SON.com. And if you do /Kvell, Kvell, you can also order her book, or you can order it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. It's an inspiring conversation. In fact, I'm quelling about it. Please join us.